Welcome to the Mona Beginner Crash Course. In this session we'll be looking at Metaverse and WebGL limitation. First we will look at polygon count, after that we will look at material count, and then we will look at textures. The most common approach to creating assets is doing so in a 3D creation application like Blender, Maya, Rhino, Revit, and many others. Do note that Blender is free and a fantastic resource to get started. As Mona runs in WebGL in a browser, we have limited resources to render our space and a set limit to how big the files can be at 250 meg for the playable files. If we use complicated assets such as too many polygons, materials, or textures, it will affect the overall experience. The most important is the frame rate, or frames per second, of your experience. Over 90 is fantastic, over 60 is good, and under 40, not so good. The target computer and its internet speed also play a part in this. A useful tool you can use in the Playground and Mona space is the page up key, if available, or function key plus up keys on short keyboards. This will tell you the current frame rate and other useful information. One of the most important elements of an asset is how many polygons it has. This may not be considered if you are coming from architecture, using applications like Revit or Rhino, or perhaps sculpting in ZBrush or VR. But in Mona, you will need to pay attention to how many polygons an asset has, as this will affect how well the space runs in the browser and how big the files are to import. A polygon is basically two triangles of a mesh. You will see both polygons, or poly, and triangles, or tris, used a lot, but the numbers are different. Triangles are generally twice the amount of polygons. You may also see n-gons as well. This is more than two triangles together to create a 5 or more sided polygon. It is difficult to say the maximum poly count as each element affects each other, so you could have a higher poly count space if you have less materials, for example. That said, there are some simple guidelines to get you started. In this example, the poly count on the left is too high for a WebGL experience and should be avoided. A hero asset can have more polygons, such as an important sculpture, a character, or a key element of a Mona space. A medium level asset could be something that is large but less important, such as props around the space. Most assets should be this or below, whereas items in the background or far away should be significantly less polygons. There are many ways to create these assets, from manually creating assets from scratch in a 3D creation tool like Blender or 3D Studio Max, to creating high polygon assets made in sculpting tools like ZBrush, and then reducing the poly counts afterwards. Reducing the poly count of assets can be done in several ways, from manually tracing the high polygon asset to make a low polygon asset, also known as retopology. This is slower, but can achieve significantly fewer polygons. There are also faster approaches to reducing poly count, such as decimation and remeshing, which result in better poly counts than the original mesh, but perhaps not as low as if you created it manually. Depending on your approach, decimation is not recommended for assets that require animation, such as VRM avatars. Another element that plays a large part in how well your space runs is what we call draw calls. A draw call is when the GPU is asked to draw something new on the screen. The more things it needs to draw, the slower it will go. One aspect of this, that is easily described, is how many materials are in your space. Each material has the potential to be a draw call. There are many techniques to reduce material count as well. Both an artist and the engine itself can help with this. Let's put this into context. If you have one mesh with one material, that is one draw call. If you have one mesh with 5 different materials, that is 5 draw calls. If you have 5 meshes using the same material, that is one draw call. If you have 5 meshes, each with its own material, that is 5 draw calls. If you have 5 meshes, each with the same 5 materials, that is 5 draw calls. If you have 5 meshes, each with 5 different materials, so 25 materials in total, that is 25 draw calls. As noted, don't worry so much about this at the moment, it is just something to keep in the back of your mind as you improve your skills. The next key element to making a Mona space is that there is a 250 meg maximum file size allowed for your space. All assets take up file size, but one of the main ones is your textures. Textures allow you to give your assets more color and detail. It could be something like a wood grain, up to a whole asset's color, metallic and smoothness, emissive, or normal map. As noted in a previous tutorial, game textures must be a power of 2, so 4x4 pixels up to 2048 by 2048. A 2K texture is quite large in file size, so keeping the number of these as few as possible or using that file size optimally is part of the process. You could use a 4K texture for the skybox, or the image surrounding your space, but this would be the only one we'd recommend using at that size. There are many ways to reduce the size of your texture, both inside and outside Unity. The easiest approach is to look at the details on the texture in the inspector and adjust the size here. You can see how the texture changes in the space. Make this as low as possible without affecting the result too much. Do note that crunch compression is not allowed due to the fact that the textures go back to the full size in the Mona space, taking up a lot of the resources. Once again, these examples are less a how-to tutorial and more about recommendations on creating a space that runs well. We recommend jumping in and making your assets with these in mind, but don't worry about it too much for now if you are just starting. Your ability to create optimized assets will improve the more practice you have. In the next tutorial, we will look at creating assets in Blender. Thanks for watching, and happy building!